April 1st, 1944. 22,000 feet above the German-Swiss border. The No. 3 engine of B-24J Liberator Liberty Belle had been smoking for the last 40 minutes. Second Lieutenant Robert Wilson, the 22-year-old pilot from Des Moines, Iowa, gripped the yoke harder than he needed to, his leather gloves creaking as he fought the slight yaw pulling the aircraft to starboard. Through the scratched Perspex windscreen, the Alps rose like jagged teeth against a steel-gray sky, their peaks disappearing into thick cloud banks that seemed to mock the formation of American bombers struggling homeward. "Pilot to crew," Wilson said into his throat MIC, his breath fogging in the -30-degree air despite his oxygen mask. "We're losing altitude. Engineer, give me a status on No. 3. Technical Sergeant James Jimmy Martinez, crouched at his station behind the cockpit, didn't need to check his gauges again. He'd been watching that oil pressure drop for the last 20 minutes. "She's running hot, Lieutenant. Oil pressure's in the red. We keep pushing her, that engine's gonna seize or worse catch fire." Wilson exchanged a glance with his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Frank Shepard, whose eyes above his oxygen mask reflected the same calculation every bomber pilot over Europe had to make: risk the aircraft or risk capture. They were part of the 392nd Bomb Group, returning from a raid on Ludwigshafen, and they were falling behind the formation. In the empty sky over enemy territory, a lone bomber was a gift to any Luftwaffe fighter pilot looking to add another kill marking to his fuselage. "Navigator," Wilson called. "Reynolds, what's our position?" In the nose compartment, First Lieutenant David Reynolds hunched over his small table, his charts weighted down against the buffeting wind that seemed to find every rivet and seam in the aircraft's aluminum skin. The Norden bomb site had been covered after they'd released their payload over the target, and now he relied on dead reckoning, a compass, and a view obscured by clouds and smoke from German flak batteries they'd passed 30 minutes ago. "We should be over southern Germany, approaching the French border," Reynolds replied, but there was uncertainty in his voice that made Wilson's jaw tighten. "Visibility's maybe a quarter mile. I can't get a fix on any landmarks." The truth was that Reynolds had lost their exact position around the same time No. 3 engine started acting up. The formation had scattered during the bomb run. The flak over Ludwigshafen had been murderous. Black clouds of 88mm shells exploding so close that Liberty Belle still had shrapnel holes in her tail section, and when they'd reformed, Wilson had been focused on keeping the aircraft in the air rather than maintaining precise navigation. "Pilot to bombardier," Wilson said. "Thompson, you see anything down there?" Second Lieutenant Carl Thompson, lying prone in the nose with Reynolds, pressed his face against the plexiglass, searching the landscape below. Between breaks in the cloud cover, he caught glimpses of terrain that didn't match what he expected to see over Germany or France. The valleys were too orderly, the villages too intact. No bomb craters. No ruins. The rail lines gleamed in the weak April sunlight, undamaged and obviously operational. "Negative landmarks, sir," Thompson reported. "But something's not right. The country below us looks untouched." In the waist of the Liberty Belle, Staff Sergeant William "Billy" O'Connor manned the left waist gun, his eyes scanning the clouds for the FW-190s or BF-109s that had harassed them on the way to the target. At 20 years old, O'Connor had flown 15 missions, and he'd learned to trust his instincts. Right now, those instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The landscape below, what he could see of it through gaps in the weather, looked like a postcard of Europe before the war: pristine, undamaged, peaceful. "Skipper," O'Connor called over the intercom, "I got a weird feeling about where we are." Wilson would have pursued that observation, but at that moment, No. 3 engine's oil pressure dropped to 0. A shudder ran through the aircraft, and thin black smoke began streaming from the cowling. "Feather No. 3. Wilson barked. Shepard's hands moved across the control panel, hitting the feathering button that would stop the propeller's rotation and reduce drag. The propeller blades twisted, aligned with the airflow, and stopped spinning. The shudder ceased, but so did several hundred horsepower of thrust. Liberty Belle dropped another 500 feet, and Wilson had to push the remaining 3 engines harder to maintain airborne. "We're not making it back to England on 3 engines, Shepard said, stating what they both knew. "Not at this altitude, not with this damage." Wilson's mind raced through the options, none of them good. They could try to nurse the aircraft back to Allied lines, hoping they didn't encounter fighters or lose another engine. They could bail out over what they hoped was France and take their chances with the French resistance. Or they could look for an emergency landing site, though finding a suitable field in the Alps seemed about as likely as No. 3 engine spontaneously repairing itself. "Reynolds," Wilson said, keeping his voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system, "I need an exact position. Now." In the nose, Reynolds was already frantically trying to identify their location. He'd caught a glimpse of a lake large, distinctive, surrounded by mountains, and he was flipping through his charts, comparing what he'd seen with the maps. His finger stopped on one possibility, and his stomach dropped. "Lieutenant," Reynolds said slowly, I think that was Lake Constance." There was a long silence on the intercom. Every man on the crew knew what Lake Constance meant. It sat on the border between Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And if they'd passed over it heading southwest, that meant, "We're over Switzerland," Reynolds finished, his voice barely a whisper. "That's impossible," Shepard said. "We were briefed to stay north of Dash. Look at the terrain." Thompson interrupted from the nose. "Everything's intact. No bomb damage, no destroyed infrastructure. Reynolds is right. We're over neutral territory." Wilson felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. Switzerland. Neutral Switzerland. They'd been briefed about the Swiss during their initial training, told that Swiss airspace was to be respected, that Switzerland was maintaining armed neutrality in the heart of German-occupied Europe, that they would intern both Allied and Axis crews that violated their airspace. But the briefings had made it sound almost routine, civilized. Fly over Switzerland by mistake, get escorted to an airfield, sit out the rest of the war in Swiss internment camps that were supposedly more like mountain resorts than POW camps. Certainly better than a German POW camp. Definitely better than bailing out and hoping the Wehrmacht found you before an angry mob of German civilians who just watched their city get bombed. "All right," Wilson said, making a decision that seemed obvious in the moment. "We're over neutral territory. We can't make it back to England on 3 engines. We're going to land in Switzerland and sit out the war. It's not the ending we wanted, but it beats a German prison camp." "Amen to that," Martinez said from his engineer's station. Several other crew members murmured agreement over the intercom. The idea of Swiss internment, clean beds, real food, no more flak or fighters suddenly seemed like winning the lottery. "Navigator, give me a heading to the nearest Swiss airfield," Wilson ordered. "Bombardier, look for anything that might be a landing strip." But before Reynolds could respond, the voice of Sergeant Harold McKinney, the tail gunner isolated in the rear of the aircraft, cut across the intercom with an urgency that made everyone's blood run cold. "Fighters. Fighters at 6 o'clock high. Coming in fast." Wilson's first thought was that the Luftwaffe had followed them across the border, which didn't make sense, but nothing about this situation made sense anymore. Then Kinney's voice came back, confused and alarmed. "Wait. These aren't German markings. They're not ours either. They've got white crosses on red dash. Swiss. The fighters were Swiss. They're probably just going to escort us," Shepard said, echoing the thought in Wilson's mind. "Guide us to an airfield. That's what the briefing said, right?" Through the clouds to their right, Wilson caught his first glimpse of the interceptors. They were sleek, single-engine fighters, and even at a distance, he could see they were moving with purpose and precision. As they closed, he could make out more details: yellow noses, distinctive inline engines, the unmistakable silhouette of German-designed Messerschmitt Bf-109s, but wearing Swiss markings. There were 3 of them, and they were coming in fast. "Waist guns, top turret, don't shoot," Wilson ordered. "They're Swiss. We're in neutral airspace. They're just going to escort us." The lead Swiss fighter closed to within 500 yards, positioning himself perfectly at their 4 o'clock position, a textbook intercept position that allowed him to observe the bomber while maintaining an angle of attack advantage. Wilson could see the pilot clearly now through the fighter's canopy, could see him gesturing. "He's signaling us," Thompson called from the nose. "Looks like he wants us to follow him." "There we go," Wilson said, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. "We're going to be okay, boys. Just follow their lead, and we'll be on the ground in dash." The world exploded in tracer fire. The Swiss fighters opened fire simultaneously, and the sky around Liberty Belle filled with streams of 20mm cannon shells and 7.92mm machine gun rounds. The distinctive hammering sound of cannon fire echoed through the bomber's fuselage as shells punched through the thin aluminum skin. The plexiglas nose shattered into 1,000 pieces as a line of machine gun fire stitched across the bombardier station. "They are shooting at us," McKinney screamed from the tail. "The Swiss are shooting at us." It was the last rational thought any of them would have for the next 30 seconds as training took over and the bomber's defensive gunners, despite orders, returned fire. The top turret erupted with the familiar roar of twin .50 caliber machine guns. The waist guns opened up. Spent brass casings clattered to the deck. The acrid smell of cordite filled the bomber's interior. In the nose, Thompson had thrown himself flat, his hands over his head, as cannon shells continued to tear through the compartment. Reynolds, hunched over his navigation table, felt something hot and sharp slice across his shoulder shrapnel from a shell that had exploded against the aircraft's frame. Blood began to soak through his flight suit. "Evasive action!" Shepard yelled, unnecessarily, as Wilson had already thrown the bomber into as steep a dive as the damaged aircraft could handle. 3 engines screaming, Liberty Belle dropped toward the clouds below, seeking any cover from the fighters that were, impossibly, trying to kill them. Another burst of cannon fire, and No. 2 engine erupted in flames. The entire left wing seemed to light up, oil and hydraulic fluid feeding the fire that immediately began streaming back toward the tail. "Fire in No. 2. Martinez shouted, already reaching for the engine fire extinguisher controls. "She's burning bad. I can't hold her." Wilson yelled, fighting the yoke as the aircraft began to roll to the left, pulled by the dead weight of the burning engine and the loss of thrust. "We're going down. Prepare for crash landing. Bail out. Bail out." Someone screamed over the intercom. Wilson wasn't sure who, maybe O'Connor from the waist, but the order made sense. The aircraft was dying beneath them, shot down by fighters from a neutral country they'd been told would simply escort them to internment. Below them, through breaks in the clouds and smoke, Wilson caught glimpses of Swiss countryside, green valleys, neat villages, farm fields arranged in precise geometric patterns. Somewhere down there was solid ground, and Liberty Belle was going to meet it very soon, one way or another. The Swiss fighters pulled up, circling above like hunting hawks that had made their kill, watching as the crippled American bomber spiraled downward, trailing fire and smoke across their pristine neutral sky. The altimeter unwound like a clock spinning backward through time. 18,000 feet, 17,000, 16,000 each, 1,000 feet of altitude lost, bringing Liberty Belle closer to either salvation or destruction. Second Lieutenant Robert Wilson's arms burned with the effort of keeping the bomber's nose up, fighting against the asymmetric thrust from the 2 working engines on the right wing and the dead weight of the burning engine on the left. "Martinez, did the extinguisher work?" Wilson shouted, though he could already see the answer. Flames still streamed from No. 2, and now the fire was eating through the engine cowling, exposing the hot metal underneath. If it reached the fuel lines in the wing, they wouldn't have to worry about crash landing. They'd simply cease to exist in a fireball visible for miles. "Negative effect, Lieutenant." Martinez called back, his voice tight with the same realization. "The extinguisher's empty. That fire's not going out." Through the shattered nose section, First Lieutenant David Reynolds pulled himself upright, his left shoulder screaming in pain where shrapnel had torn through muscle and possibly bone. Blood ran down his arm, but he was alive, and that was more than Second Lieutenant Carl Thompson could say. The bombardier lay crumpled against the plexiglas, motionless, a line of bullet holes across his back showing where the Swiss machine gun fire had found him. Reynolds reached for Thompson's throat, searching for a pulse, but he already knew. The young man from Michigan who'd been excited about seeing Swiss Alps had died viewing them through a gun sight. "Pilot, this is Navigator," Reynolds said into his MIC, his voice steady despite the shock and pain. "Thompson's dead. Nose sections destroyed. I'm hit but mobile." Wilson absorbed the information with the practiced detachment of a combat pilot who couldn't afford to feel until later if there was a later. "Copy that. Can you move to the radio room?" "Roger, moving now." In the waist section, Staff Sergeant William O'Connor and Sergeant Joseph Joe Kowalski manned the guns, their hands still on the triggers though the Swiss fighters had broken off their attack. O'Connor's mind reeled with incomprehension. They'd shot at the Swiss returned fire against a neutral country, but only because the Swiss had opened fire first. Nothing in any briefing had prepared them for this. The Swiss were supposed to be the good guys, the safe harbor, the neutral ground where both sides respected the rules. "Joe, you hit." O'Connor shouted over the roar of wind tearing through the waste gun ports. "Negative," Kowalski yelled back. "But I don't understand what the hell just happened. Why'd they shoot at us?" O'Connor had no answer. Below them, through the gun port, he could see they were descending through scattered clouds, the Swiss landscape rising up to meet them with alarming speed. Lakes, mountains, valleys covered in snow despite it being April. It looked like something from a travel poster, peaceful and civilized, which made the violence of the last 2 minutes feel even more surreal. In the tail section, Sergeant Harold McKinney had stopped firing, his hands shaking as he watched the Swiss fighters circle above. He'd counted the hits, at least 50 rounds of cannon and machine gun fire that had struck Liberty Belle in that first devastating pass. 50 rounds fired by a neutral country at an aircraft that posed no threat, carried no bombs for Swiss targets, wanted only to land and surrender. "Pilot, tail gunner," McKinney called, his voice shaky. "The Swiss fighters are maintaining distance. I think they're watching to make sure we go down." "Let them watch," Wilson said grimly. "We've got bigger problems. Everyone, listen up. We're too low to bail out safely, and I don't trust these engines to get us to any airfield. I'm going to try to set us down in the first suitable field I can find. Crash positions. Now." The crew moved with practiced efficiency despite the terror clawing at their chests. Reynolds, blood still seeping from his shoulder, braced himself in the radio room. Martinez moved to his crash position behind the cockpit. In the waist, O'Connor and Kowalski secured their guns and dropped to the floor, backs against the fuselage, knees pulled tight. McKinney, trapped in the tail section, could only wedge himself as firmly as possible and pray. At 8,000 feet, Wilson saw his opportunity: a valley with a flat meadow, still brown from winter but free of obvious obstacles. It wasn't ideal. The field was short, maybe 1,500 feet at best, and Liberty Belle needed at least twice that under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. Normal circumstances didn't involve being shot down by a neutral country. "Co-pilot, give me full flaps when I call for them," Wilson ordered. "Landing gear stays up. We're going in on the belly." Shepard nodded, his hands already positioned on the flap control. A wheels-up landing would tear up the bomber's underside, but it would also slow them down faster, and right now, slow was the difference between walking away and being carried away. 6,000 feet. Wilson could see details now: a farmhouse at the edge of the meadow, a stone wall bordering one side, a small road cutting across the far end. He aimed for the center of the field, calculating angles and distances that would have been easier with 4 working engines and no fire consuming his left wing. 4,000 feet. The fire on number 2 had spread to the wing itself, eating through aluminum skin, and Wilson could feel the control surfaces becoming mushy as hydraulic lines failed. Liberty Belle was dying, and she was determined to take her crew with her if Wilson didn't get her on the ground in the next 60 seconds. "Brace! Brace! Brace!" Wilson shouted into the intercom. 2,000 feet. The meadow rushed up toward them, and Wilson could see it wasn't as flat as it had appeared from altitude. There were ruts, probably from farm equipment, and rocks protruding from the earth like broken teeth. 1,000 feet. Full flaps. Shepard yanked the flap control, and Liberty Belle's nose pitched up as the flaps extended, creating drag and lift simultaneously. Wilson pushed the yoke forward, fighting to keep the nose from rising too high and stalling them into an uncontrolled drop. 500 feet. He could see people now, Swiss farmers running from the farmhouse, pointing at the burning bomber about to crash in their field. A woman with her hand over her mouth. A child being pulled inside. 200 feet. Wilson cut power to all 3 remaining engines. The sudden silence, broken only by the whistle of wind over torn metal, felt almost peaceful. 50 feet. The bomber hit the ground with a violence that turned the world into chaos. The fuselage scraped across the earth with a shriek of tearing metal. The nose plowed into the soft spring soil, throwing up a wall of dirt. The tail whipped sideways, and Wilson felt the aircraft begin to yaw, rotating as it slid across the meadow. Inside, the crew was thrown against their restraints. McKinney, in the tail, felt the entire rear section flex and buckle as it impacted a boulder hidden in the grass. Metal screamed. Rivets popped like gunfire. The top turret separated from its mounting and crashed into the fuselage roof. Wilson and Shepard were thrown forward against their harnesses so hard that the straps cut into their shoulders and chest. The instrument panel collapsed inward. The windscreen, already cracked, shattered completely, spraying them with glass particles that their goggles barely deflected. And then, after what felt like an eternity compressed into 5 seconds, Liberty Belle stopped moving. The bomber sat in the Swiss meadow, her back broken, her nose buried in earth, her left wing still burning, a 30-ton monument to the violent enforcement of neutrality. For a moment, there was only silence punctuated by the crackle of flames. Then Wilson's training kicked in. Evacuate. Everyone out. Move, move, move. He fumbled with his harness with hands that wouldn't quite work right, his fingers numb from adrenaline and cold. Beside him, Shepard was already free, kicking open his side window and dropping to the ground. Wilson followed, dropping 8 feet to land hard on Swiss soil, his ankles screaming in protest but holding. Get clear of the aircraft. Wilson shouted, stumbling away from the burning bomber. Get clear before she explodes. The crew poured out of Liberty Belle through any opening they could find: shattered windows, torn sections of fuselage, the camera hatch in the belly. Martinez emerged from a waste window, his face blackened with smoke. O'Connor and Kowalski dropped from the rear exit, helping each other away from the wreck. Reynolds, his shoulder soaked in blood, crawled out of the radio room hatch with Martinez pulling him free. McKinney was last, climbing out of the tail section just as the fire reached Liberty Belle's fuel tanks. The explosion wasn't as dramatic as Hollywood would later make it: no massive fireball engulfing everything, but it was effective. A whump of igniting fuel, followed by a rush of hot air that knocked the closest crew members to the ground. Flames surged through the fuselage, consuming what remained of the bomber's interior. Black smoke rose into the Swiss sky, a pillar marking where an American bomber had learned that neutral didn't mean friendly. Wilson counted heads. 8 men standing, sitting, or lying in the Swiss meadow. Thompson dead in the nose. 1 crew member missing. Where's Harrison? Wilson shouted, referring to their radio operator, Technical Sergeant Robert Harrison, who should have been in the radio room. He bailed out. Reynolds said, coughing, his hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. Over the mountains. I saw his chute deploy. So Harrison was somewhere in the Swiss Alps, alone, probably injured, definitely confused about why a neutral country had just shot them out of the sky. Wilson added it to the growing list of problems he'd have to deal with if they survived the next few minutes. Because approaching across the meadow, at a run, were Swiss soldiers. At least a dozen of them, rifles raised, shouting in German, or was it Swiss German? Wilson couldn't tell the difference, and it didn't matter because the intent was clear. They were being surrounded by armed men who represented a country that had just tried to kill them. Wilson raised his hands, and his crew followed suit. They were unarmed except for their service pistols, which none of them had drawn. There would be no resistance. They were defeated, exhausted, confused, and on foreign soil. The Swiss soldiers surrounded them with military precision, their rifles Schmidt-Rubin straight-pull bolt actions. Wilson noted absently trained on the Americans. An officer approached, a lieutenant from his insignia, his face stern but not hostile. He was young, maybe Wilson's age, and he looked at the burning bomber, then at the crew, then back at the bomber with an expression that might have been regret. Americanish? The Swiss officer asked. Yes, American, Wilson replied, then added hopefully, United States Army Air Forces. We're here to surrender. We mean no harm to Switzerland. We got lost, had engine trouble dash. You were warned, the Swiss officer said in accented but clear English. You did not follow instructions. You fired upon Swiss aircraft. Your fighters shot at us first. O'Connor burst out, unable to contain himself. We weren't attacking anyone. We were just trying to land. The Swiss officer's expression didn't change. You violated Swiss airspace. You were ordered to follow our fighters to an airfield. You did not comply. Our fighters were authorized to use force. Wilson felt anger rising through his shock and exhaustion. "We didn't know. No one told us you'd shoot us down. We thought What you thought is not relevant," the officer said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a negotiation. "Switzerland is neutral. Our neutrality must be enforced, or it means nothing. You will come with us. Your wounded will be treated. The rest of you will be interned." As Swiss soldiers moved in to search and secure the crew, Wilson looked back at Liberty Belle, flames consuming what remained of his aircraft. Thompson's body was still in there, burning in a neutral country that had killed him for the crime of being lost. Harrison was somewhere in the mountains, probably scared and alone. His crew was captured. His aircraft destroyed. And somewhere overhead, the Swiss fighters that had done this were probably landing at their base, their pilots filing reports about another successful interception, another violation of Swiss airspace punished, another demonstration to both the Allies and the Axis that Switzerland's neutrality was not to be tested. As the Swiss soldiers led them away toward waiting trucks, Wilson found himself thinking about all the briefings they'd attended in England before their missions. Hours of instruction about German flak patterns, Luftwaffe tactics, emergency procedures, what to do if shot down over occupied territory. But no one, not one single intelligence officer or commanding officer, had adequately warned them about this. No one had told them that neutral Switzerland would shoot to kill. Behind them, Liberty Belle burned, and the spring wind carried the smoke east toward Germany, west toward France, and up toward the Allied bombers still overhead, continuing their missions, unaware that one of their own had just learned the most expensive lesson of the air war. In neutral airspace, there were no allies. The Swiss military truck bounced along a mountain road, its canvas cover flapping in the wind as it climbed higher into the Alps. In the back, Second Lieutenant Robert Wilson sat with his crew, surrounded by Swiss soldiers whose rifles never quite pointed directly at the Americans but never quite pointed away either. Through the gap in the canvas, Wilson watched the Swiss countryside pass by villages with church steeples, farms with neat rows of crops, factories with smokestacks producing what he assumed was war material for someone's war effort. First Lieutenant David Reynolds sat across from him, his shoulder now wrapped in bandages applied by a Swiss medic who'd worked with efficient, impersonal precision. The bleeding had stopped, but Reynolds's face was pale, his lips pressed thin against pain. None of them had spoken much since being loaded into the trucks 40 minutes ago. What was there to say? They were prisoners of a country they'd been told was neutral, shot down by fighters they'd been told would escort them safely. Staff Sergeant William O'Connor finally broke the silence, his voice low. "Skipper, I don't understand. Why'd they shoot us down? We weren't bombing Switzerland. We weren't attacking anyone." Wilson had been asking himself the same question, running through the engagement again and again in his mind. The Swiss fighters had positioned themselves perfectly, had given some kind of signal, though what that signal meant, Wilson hadn't understood in the moment, and then opened fire. Not warning shots. Not shots across the bow. They'd aimed to kill, and they'd succeeded in killing Thompson and nearly killing all of them. "I don't know, O'Connor," Wilson admitted. "But I intend to find out." The truck began to slow, and through the canvas gap, Wilson caught sight of their destination. A stone building complex that looked like it might have been a school or administrative center in peacetime, now surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Swiss flags flew from several poles, the white cross on red background snapping in the mountain wind. Armed guards stood at the gates, and as the truck passed through, Wilson saw other men in various uniforms: British RAF blue, American olive drab, even what looked like German Luftwaffe grey. "Christ," Martinez muttered. "How many guys are they holding here?" The truck stopped in a courtyard, and Swiss soldiers gestured for the Americans to dismount. As they climbed out, stiff and sore from the crash landing, a British officer approached. He wore a flight lieutenant's uniform, RAF insignia still visible despite the wear. He was older than Wilson, maybe 30, with a neat mustache and eyes that had seen too much. "Americans?" the British officer asked, his accent marking him as from somewhere in southern England. 392nd Bomb Group, Wilson confirmed. "We were shot down by Swiss fighters about 2 hours ago. Our bombardier was killed." The British officer's expression shifted to something like sympathy mixed with resignation. "Flight Lieutenant James Cartwright, 158 Squadron. Shot down 3 months ago under similar circumstances. I'm sorry about your man. How many times did they warn you? Warn us. Wilson felt his anger rising again. They didn't warn us. They just opened fire. Cartwright shook his head slowly. They warned you. Radio transmission on 121.5 MHz, the international distress frequency. Probably in English, German, and French. When you didn't respond or didn't comply fast enough, they shot. That's their protocol. Our radio operator bailed out over the mountains, Reynolds said, his voice strained with pain. We lost him before we heard any warnings. That explains it then, Cartwright said, though his tone suggested it didn't really explain anything, or rather, it explained everything and nothing at the same time. Come on. I'll show you to the barracks and explain how things work here. The Swiss are proper about it, they follow the Geneva Convention, we're technically interned, not imprisoned, but make no mistake, gentlemen, we're not going anywhere until this war ends. As they walked across the courtyard, Wilson saw other airmen, dozens of them standing in small groups, talking, smoking, playing cards. Some wore heavy coats despite the spring weather. Others had clearly been here long enough to have obtained civilian clothes. They all had the same look, men suspended in time, neither free nor exactly captive, waiting for a war to end that they could no longer fight in. How many are here? Martinez asked. In this camp? About 200, Cartwright replied. Throughout Switzerland? Over 1,000 Allied airmen at last count, and about the same number of Germans and Italians. The Swiss are scrupulously fair about it, they intern everyone who violates their airspace, regardless of which side they're on. They entered a long wooden barracks building, heated by a single stove that did little against the mounting cold. Bunks lined both walls, most of them occupied by personal belongings, books, letters, photographs from home. Cartwright led them to an empty section where they could claim beds. First thing you need to understand, Cartwright said, his voice taking on the tone of someone who'd given this speech before, is that Switzerland isn't neutral because they love peace. They're neutral because they're surrounded by the Axis powers, and their neutrality is all that keeps the Wehrmacht from rolling across their borders. You saw how intact everything was when you flew over, yes? Wilson nodded, remembering the undamaged railways, the functioning factories, the villages untouched by bombs. That's because Switzerland has convinced both sides that it's more valuable neutral than conquered, Cartwright continued. They trade with both Germany and the Allies. They store gold for both sides. Their factories produce precision instruments, weapons, ammunition for whoever pays. And they enforce their neutrality with absolute, lethal force because the moment they appear weak or biased toward one side, the other side invades. So they shoot down American bombers to prove to Hitler they're not Allied sympathizers, O'Connor said bitterly. They shoot down everyone who violates their airspace, Cartwright corrected. Germans, Italians, Americans, British. I've spoken to Luftwaffe pilots here who had the same experience you did, ordered to follow, didn't understand or didn't comply fast enough, got shot down. The Swiss don't discriminate in their violence. A new voice joined the conversation, American, with a southern drawl. Flight lieutenants got it right. Name's Captain Thomas Mitchell, 97th Bomb Group. Shot down September 6, 1943. I was one of the first. Wilson turned to see a lean American officer with captain's bars, his uniform faded from months of wear. Mitchell had the look of a man who'd been handsome once but was now weathered by stress and frustration. What happened to your crew? Wilson asked. Mitchell's jaw tightened. Lost 2 men. Pilot and co-pilot. Swiss 20mm cannon shell hit the cockpit dead center. My bombardier, who'd never flown left seat in his life, had to land what was left of our bird in a field with the nose blown off. We thought the Swiss would be apologetic, that it was some kind of mistake. Instead, they gave us a lecture about respecting neutral airspace and stuck us in here. He sat down on one of the bunks, and Wilson noticed other American airmen drifting over, drawn by the arrival of new inmates who might have news from the outside world, from the war they were no longer fighting. How many American crews have they shot down? Wilson asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. 11 confirmed, Mitchell said. Could be more. Some guys bail out over the mountains and never get found. Some make it across the border back into France or Germany before the Swiss can grab them. but 11 confirmed aircraft destroyed, and at least 20 American airmen killed in the process. Plus another dozen or so British. 20 men dead. Thompson's face flashed in Wilson's mind, the young bombardier from Michigan who'd been excited about seeing Europe, who'd talked about visiting Switzerland on leave if they ever got the chance. Well, Thompson had made it to Switzerland, and Switzerland had killed him for it. The thing you have to understand, another voice said, this one belonging to a tall American lieutenant with a bandage wrapped around his head, is that the Swiss are terrified. Absolutely terrified. Lieutenant Robert Fitzgerald, 303rd Bomb Group, the man introduced himself. Shot down January 15th. Took shrapnel to the head but survived. Here's what I've learned talking to the Swiss guards who speak English. Switzerland is tiny, surrounded by Axis territory on almost all sides, and their entire strategy is convincing Hitler that invading them would cost more than it's worth. Fitzgerald pulled out a worn map of Europe and spread it on a bunk. His finger traced Switzerland's borders: Germany to the north, Italy to the south, Vichy France to the west, Austria to the east. Look at this. By 1943, Switzerland is an island in an Axis sea. Their military is maybe 400,000 men at full mobilization, and they know that number couldn't stop the Wehrmacht if Hitler decided to take them. So instead, they make themselves useful. They trade with Germany, lots of trade. Financial services, weapons manufacturing, precision instruments. At the same time, they maintain just enough contact with the Allies to keep everyone guessing. So they shoot us down to prove to Hitler they're serious about neutrality, Reynolds said, his voice hoarse with pain and exhaustion. Exactly, Fitzgerald confirmed. Every time an Allied bomber crosses into Swiss airspace, German radar stations see it. German spotters note it. If the Swiss just wave them through, escort them safely to an airfield and send them home with a slap on the wrist, what message does that send to Berlin? It says Switzerland is Allied sympathizers, and suddenly the strategic calculus changes. Maybe invading Switzerland starts looking like a good idea. Wilson felt his understanding shifting, pieces clicking into place that he didn't want to accept. So we're sacrificial pawns in a geopolitical game. You're proof of Swiss neutrality, Cartwright said quietly. Every bomber they shoot down, every crew they intern, every time they fire on an Allied aircraft is evidence they can show to German intelligence that Switzerland isn't playing favorites. It keeps them neutral, and keeping them neutral keeps them from being invaded. That's cold, Martinez said. That's really cold. That's survival, Mitchell countered. Look, I hate it as much as you do. I've been stuck here for 8 months watching the war continue without me, knowing my crew back home has a replacement pilot flying my missions. But here's the reality. If Switzerland gets invaded, it becomes a battlefield. Millions of Swiss civilians would die or be displaced. The country would be destroyed. And it wouldn't even slow down the German war machine, they'd just roll through and keep going. So the Swiss leadership made a choice: defend their neutrality with force, even lethal force, against everyone who violates it. A Swiss guard entered the barracks, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He spoke in German to Cartwright, who translated. Lieutenant Wilson and Lieutenant Reynolds, you're wanted for debriefing. The rest of your crew can rest. Reynolds, they're taking you to the medical facility to properly treat that shoulder. As Wilson and Reynolds followed the guard out of the barracks, Wilson cast a last look at his crew: Martinez, O'Connor, Kowalski, McKinney, and the others, scattered on bunks in a Swiss internment camp, prisoners of a country that claimed to be on no one's side. The debriefing room was sparse: a wooden table, several chairs, a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. 3 Swiss officers waited, a colonel who looked to be in his 50s, a major with intelligence insignia, and a captain who served as translator, though as it turned out, the colonel's English was nearly perfect. Lieutenant Wilson, the colonel said, gesturing to a chair. I am Colonel Werner Hauptmann, Swiss Air Force. Please, sit. You as well, Lieutenant Reynolds, though I understand you will soon go to medical care. Wilson sat, his exhaustion making the chair feel like a throne. Reynolds eased himself down carefully, his wounded shoulder making him wince. I want to know why you shot us down, Wilson said bluntly, too tired and angry for diplomacy. We weren't attacking Switzerland. We had engine trouble. We were trying to land. You killed one of my men. Colonel Hauptmann's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he'd heard this before, probably from every Allied airman who'd sat in this chair. Lieutenant, what were your orders regarding Swiss airspace? To avoid it, Wilson admitted. And yet you did not avoid it. Why? Engine failure, navigation error due to weather, battle damage, take your pick. We got lost. It happens in war. Yes, it happens, Hauptmann agreed. It happens regularly. American and British bombers violate our airspace an average of twice per week. Do you know how many German aircraft violate our airspace? Wilson shook his head. Nearly as many. We shoot them down too, Lieutenant. We have killed German pilots. We have interned German crews. The Luftwaffe complains to Berlin, and Berlin complains to us, just as Washington complains when we shoot down American bombers. We are an equal opportunity enforcer of our airspace. You could have just escorted us to an airfield, Wilson said. That's what we were told would happen. You were told incorrectly, Hauptmann replied, his tone matter-of-fact. Switzerland's policy on airspace violations has been clear since 1940. Any aircraft entering Swiss airspace will be intercepted. If that aircraft does not immediately respond to radio instructions and follow our fighters to a designated airfield, it will be fired upon. If it returns fire or attempts to flee, it will be shot down. We didn't hear any radio instructions, Reynolds interjected. Our radio operator bailed out before we reached your territory. Hauptmann made a note on a pad. That is unfortunate but irrelevant to our fighters' actions. They transmitted warnings on multiple frequencies. When your aircraft did not respond and did not follow their lead aircraft, they engaged per protocol. When your gunners fired upon Swiss aircraft, our pilots were fully justified in destroying your bomber. Wilson felt his fists clench under the table. Protocol. Justified. You're talking about killing people who weren't your enemies. No, Lieutenant, I'm talking about defending Swiss neutrality, which is the only thing preventing this country from becoming a German vassal state or a battlefield. Hauptmann leaned forward, and for the first time, Wilson saw something other than professional detachment in the colonel's face: exhaustion, perhaps, or the weight of decisions that required killing men who weren't enemies. Do you know what Germany could do to Switzerland if we gave them cause? Hauptmann continued. We have 3 mountain passes and several key rail lines that Germany desperately wants to control for transporting material between Germany and Italy. We have factories producing precision instruments that Germany needs. We have banks holding assets for both sides of this war. If Germany invades us, none of that continues. We become occupied territory, our people become subjects of the Reich, and our value to either side disappears. So you shoot down American bombers to keep Hitler happy, Wilson said. We shoot down all aircraft that violate our airspace to keep everyone convinced that our neutrality is real and enforced, Hauptmann corrected. If we only shot down German aircraft, the Reich would invade. If we only shot down Allied aircraft, the Allies would bomb us. We must be neutral, and we must be seen to be neutral, and that means treating all violations the same way. The colonel stood, signaling the end of the debriefing. Your crew will be interned here for the duration of the war. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will receive mail, medical care, adequate food, and shelter. You will not be tortured or abused. But you will not leave until this war is over. That is the price of violating Swiss neutrality, Lieutenant Wilson. For Switzerland, it is the price of survival. As guards led them out Reynolds to the medical facility, Wilson back to the barracks. Wilson thought about Thompson burning in Liberty Belle's nose, about Harrison somewhere in the mountains, about the 8 other American bombers and however many German aircraft that had been shot down over neutral territory. He thought about the crews back in England who would continue to fly missions, some of whom would make the same navigation errors, suffer the same engine failures, make the same assumptions about Swiss neutrality being soft instead of hard. And he thought about the strategic calculus that turned men into symbols, that required killing to prove you weren't taking sides, that made neutrality not a passive stance but an active, violent enforcement of boundaries that existed only because everyone believed in them enough to respect them or feared them enough to avoid them. Thompson was dead because Switzerland had to prove it would kill to stay neutral. And somewhere in Berlin and London and Washington, Generals and politicians were making the same cold calculations. How many men was Swiss neutrality worth? How many bombers could be sacrificed to navigation errors before someone changed the briefings, the flight plans, the rules of engagement? Wilson didn't have those answers. He only had a bunk in a barracks in the Alps, and the knowledge that the war would continue without him, and that somewhere over Europe, another bomber crew was making a mistake that might bring them to Switzerland, where neutral didn't mean safe. It just meant they'd shoot you down impartially. 6 weeks later. Warwillermoos internment camp, Lucerne, Switzerland. Second Lieutenant Robert Wilson stood at the barbed wire fence, watching Swiss farmers work fields that had never seen a bomb crater. Spring had fully arrived in the valleys below the Alps, and the landscape looked like something from a propaganda poster about European pastoral life. Neat rows of crops, cattle grazing on hillsides, church bells marking the hours with mechanical precision. It was beautiful and peaceful, and Wilson hated every pristine inch of it. Behind him, in the campyard, his crew had scattered into the rhythms of internment. Technical Sergeant James Martinez played cards with British airmen who'd been shot down over Swiss airspace in 1943. Staff Sergeant William O'Connor had taken up woodcarving, producing small figurines that he traded with guards for cigarettes and news from the outside world. First Lieutenant David Reynolds, his shoulder healing slowly in the camp hospital, spent his days writing letters home that Swiss censors would read before allowing them to be sent. But it was the absence that Wilson felt most acutely. Second Lieutenant Carl Thompson, who'd never left Liberty Belle's nose, was buried in a Swiss military cemetery with other Allied and Axis airmen, Germans next to Americans next to British, all equal in death on neutral ground. And Technical Sergeant Robert Harrison remained missing, lost somewhere in the Swiss Alps after bailing out during their final moments over Swiss airspace. Still thinking about Harrison? A voice asked. Wilson turned to see Captain Thomas Mitchell approaching, the 97th Bomb Group pilot who'd been interned since September 1943. Mitchell had become something of a mentor to Wilson in the weeks since their arrival, explaining the unwritten rules of Swiss internment, the political realities that kept them here, and the psychological strategies for surviving indefinitely suspended between war and peace. "Every day," Wilson admitted. "Has there been any word?" Mitchell shook his head. "The Swiss are still searching, but it's been 6 weeks. The Alps are massive, and if he came down in the wrong valley..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They both knew the Swiss mountains claimed lives hikers, skiers, and parachuting airmen who landed in places where no one would find them until the snow melted, if ever. "I keep thinking about what I could have done differently," Wilson said. "If I'd maintained better navigation, if I'd caught the engine trouble earlier, if I'd understood what the Swiss fighters wanted dash." "You'd still be here," Mitchell interrupted firmly. "Or you'd be dead. Those are the only 2 outcomes when you enter Swiss airspace without permission, Wilson. You did everything right once things went wrong. You got most of your crew down alive. Thompson's death is on the Swiss, not on you. Try telling that to his parents when they get the telegram." Mitchell was quiet for a moment, then said, "Come with me. There's something you should see." They walked across the camp compound to a small building that served as a library and recreation room. Inside, Mitchell pulled out a folder thick with papers, newspaper clippings, official documents, hand-drawn maps, and what looked like intelligence reports that shouldn't have been accessible to interned airmen but somehow were. "I've been documenting Swiss air defenses since I got here," Mitchell explained, spreading the papers across a table. "Talking to other crews, comparing notes, building a picture of how Switzerland enforces its neutrality. You want to understand what happened to your crew. This is the full story." Wilson leaned over the documents, his eyes scanning dates and locations. September 6, 1943, B-17 shot down near Zurich, 2 killed. October 17, 1943, RAF Lancaster intercepted over Basel, forced to land, crew interned. December 5, 1943, B-24 engaged by Swiss fighters over St. Gallen, 1 engine destroyed, emergency landing. January 15, 1944, B-17 shot down, that was Fitzgerald's crew. March 18, 1944, another B-24, 3 crew killed. And there, April 1, 1944, Liberty Belle. 11 confirmed American bombers shot down or forced down, Mitchell said. 6 British. But here's what's interesting, look at the German losses. He pointed to another section of documents. October 1943, Luftwaffe Ju-88 shot down over Schaffhausen. November 1943, Me-109 intercepted and destroyed. January 1944, He-111 engaged, forced to land. The list went on. 9 German aircraft destroyed or interned since 1943. The Swiss are keeping score, Wilson said slowly, understanding. They're making sure they shoot down roughly equal numbers from both sides. It's more calculated than that, Mitchell said, pulling out a hand-drawn chart. Watch the pattern. Every time the Swiss shoot down an Allied aircraft, within 2 weeks they intercept a German aircraft. Every time they intern an American crew, they make sure to intern a German crew shortly after. It's like they're balancing a ledger, proving to both sides that they're genuinely neutral. Flight Lieutenant James Cartwright entered the library, carrying more documents. The British officer had become the unofficial historian of Swiss internment, collecting stories from every Allied airman who passed through the camps. Mitchell showing you his research? Cartwright asked. He's become quite the scholar of Swiss air defense doctrine. Doctrine, Wilson repeated. That's a clinical word for shooting down unarmed bombers. They're not unarmed, Cartwright corrected gently. Your bomber had 10.50 caliber machine guns. My Lancaster had 8.303 machine guns. We're military aircraft, Wilson, and we violated the airspace of a neutral country. Under international law, they have every right to defend their territory. But the level of force is calculated to ensure we never come back, Mitchell interjected. Think about it from the Swiss perspective. If they just escort violating aircraft to airfields, intern the crews comfortably, and eventually repatriate everyone when the war ends, what's the deterrent? Crews might start deliberately getting lost over Switzerland as a way to escape combat duty. A few missions over Germany, then oops, wrong turn. Guess we'll sit out the war in Swiss internment eating chocolate and looking at mountains. So they make examples, Wilson said bitterly. They kill people to scare others away. They enforce consequences, Cartwright said. And it works. How many briefings did you sit through in England before your missions? Dozens. How many times were you told to avoid Swiss airspace? Wilson thought back to the navigation briefings, the intelligence updates, the warnings about where not to fly. Swiss airspace had always been mentioned, but casually, as if it was just another piece of information rather than a critical safety concern. Several times, Wilson admitted. But we were never told they'd shoot to kill. We were told they'd intern us, that Swiss internment was, well, easier than a German POW camp. That's because your command didn't want to believe it, Mitchell said. I've talked to crews who got back to England after close calls with Swiss fighters. They reported aggressive intercepts, warning shots that seemed more than warnings. But nobody in 8th Air Force wanted to admit that a neutral country was shooting down American bombers. It's embarrassing. It complicates the narrative. How do you explain to the American public that Switzerland neutral, democratic, home of the Red Cross's killing American airmen? Cartwright pulled out a newspaper clipping from a Swiss paper, translated into English. The headline read, Swiss Air Force defends neutrality 3 violations intercepted this month. This is how the Swiss public sees it, Cartwright said. Not as shooting down Allied bombers, but as defending Swiss sovereignty against all violators. They're proud of their Air Force. These pilots are heroes in Switzerland, not because they're killing Germans or Americans, but because they're keeping Switzerland out of the war. The door opened, and a Swiss guard entered, speaking rapid German. Cartwright translated, Wilson, you have a visitor. Someone from the American legation in Bern. Wilson's heart jumped. The American legation, that meant official U.S. representation, potentially news about repatriation or at least communication with the outside world. He followed the guard to a small meeting room where a man in a civilian suit waited, looking uncomfortable in the military setting. Lieutenant Wilson? I'm Gerald Patterson, attaché with the American legation. I'm here to check on the welfare of American internees and to provide some information about your status. Wilson sat down across from Patterson, studying the man's face for any indication of good news. He found none. First, let me express the condolences of the United States government for the loss of Second Lieutenant Thompson, Patterson began. His family has been notified. Second, I have to inform you that Technical Sergeant Harrison's body was found 3 weeks ago by Swiss search teams. He did not survive the parachute landing. The terrain where he came down was extremely difficult, and it appears he suffered fatal injuries upon impact with a rocky outcrop. His remains have been recovered and will be interred with full military honors. Wilson felt the words hit him like physical blows. Harrison dead. Another crew member gone, another telegram to another family, another empty bunk back in England that would be filled by some replacement who'd never know the men who came before. I'm sorry, Lieutenant, Patterson continued, his voice gentler. I know this is difficult. Now, regarding your internment status, Switzerland is obligated under international law to intern all belligerent military personnel who enter their territory. You and your crew will remain here for the duration of hostilities. The Swiss government treats internees well receiving adequate food, medical care, and housing per the Geneva Convention, but you will not be repatriated until the war ends or unless you're severely wounded and deemed unfit for further military service. How long? Wilson asked, his voice hollow. There's no way to know. Could be months. Could be years. The war in Europe continues, and there's no end in sight. And the Swiss will keep shooting down our bombers. Patterson's expression tightened. That's a complicated matter, Lieutenant. The US government has filed formal protests with Switzerland about their aggressive interception policies. Switzerland maintains that they're within their rights under international law to defend their airspace against all violators. Both governments are trying to find a middle ground, but... He trailed off, leaving the obvious unsaid. But Switzerland is more worried about what Germany thinks than what America thinks, Wilson finished. Switzerland is worried about survival, Patterson corrected carefully. They're surrounded by Axis powers, Lieutenant. Germany could invade tomorrow if they decided Switzerland's neutrality was a facade. Every American bomber that flies over Switzerland is seen by German radar operators, noted by German intelligence. If the Swiss don't respond with force, Germany sees it as evidence of Allied sympathy. And if Germany invades Switzerland, we lose our main intelligence hub in Central Europe, our diplomatic backchannel to Germany, and our access to Swiss banks where we track Axis financial movements. Wilson leaned back in his chair, the full geopolitical picture finally becoming clear. So we're sacrificed for the greater good. The crews they shoot down, the men they kill, that's all acceptable losses to keep Switzerland neutral and useful to our intelligence services. Patterson didn't deny it. War requires difficult choices, Lieutenant. I'm sorry you and your crew had to pay the price for one of those choices. But yes, the strategic calculation in Washington is that maintaining Swiss neutrality, even when that neutrality sometimes costs American lives, is worth it for the intelligence access and diplomatic channels it provides. After Patterson left, Wilson returned to the barracks where his crew had gathered. They could see from his face that the news wasn't good, and when he told them about Harrison, the room fell into the heavy silence of men absorbing another loss. That's 2, Martinez said quietly. 2 out of 10. 20% casualties from a neutral country. Could have been worse, Sergeant Harold McKinney said from his bunk. Could have been all of us. Liberty Belle should have exploded when we crashed. We got lucky. Lucky, O'Connor repeated bitterly. We're prisoners in Switzerland, 2 of our crew are dead, and we're going to sit here for God knows how long while the war goes on without us. Some luck. Wilson looked at his crew, these men who trusted him to lead them through flak and fighters over Germany, who'd survived the most heavily defended targets in Europe, only to be shot down by a country that claimed no allegiance to either side. They were angry and frustrated and grieving, and they deserved better than platitudes about geopolitics and strategic necessity. Listen, Wilson said, drawing their attention. I've learned a lot in the last 6 weeks. About why the Swiss do what they do, about the impossible position they're in, about the bigger picture that got us shot down. And none of it changes the fact that Thompson and Harrison are dead, that we're stuck here, that what happened to us was wrong on every level that matters to us as human beings. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But here's what I also learned. We're not the only ones. There are over 1,000 Allied airmen in Swiss camps right now. British, American, Canadian, even some French. And there are just as many German and Italian airmen in other camps. Switzerland is full of men who made mistakes, had bad luck, or just got lost in the wrong piece of sky. We're all prisoners of geography and politics. What's your point, Skipper? Martinez asked. My point is that we're alive, Wilson said. Thompson and Harrison aren't, and that's on the Swiss and their policy and the whole twisted calculus of neutral survival. But we survived. We're going to sit out the rest of this war, and when it's over, and it will be over, Germany can't hold out forever. We're going home. We're going to see our families again. We're going to tell this story, and maybe our story will make sure the next generation of pilots knows that neutral doesn't mean friendly, that Switzerland will shoot to kill, that you don't fly over the Alps unless you're damn sure you can make it through. Over the following months, as spring turned to summer and summer to fall, Wilson and his crew settled into the strange limbo of internment. They received mail from home, censored but cherished. They attended classes taught by other interned airmen, languages, mathematics, history, anything to keep their minds active. They played sports, organized concerts, celebrated American holidays with whatever materials they could scrounge. And they watched as more bombers fell from Swiss skies. July 1944, a B-17 shot down over Zurich, 3 killed. September 1944, a Lancaster forced down, crew interned. October 1944, another B-24, emergency landing after Swiss fighters damaged 2 engines. Each new arrival brought the same story. They didn't know the Swiss would shoot with lethal intent. They thought neutral meant safe. They learned too late that Switzerland defended its airspace with the same ferocity it defended its borders on the ground. By December 1944, Wilson had been interned for 8 months. Christmas in a Swiss camp meant carols in multiple languages, packages from home that arrived months late, and news from the outside world that Germany was finally, slowly, being defeated. The Allies had landed in Normandy in June. They'd liberated Paris in August. The Red Army was pushing from the east. The end was coming, though how soon, no one could say. On Christmas Eve, Wilson stood at the same fence where he'd stood 6 weeks after his arrival, looking at the same pastoral landscape that still showed no signs of war. Next to him stood Flight Lieutenant Cartwright and Captain Mitchell, 3 Allied officers from 3 different air forces, united by the shared experience of being shot down by a country that was supposed to be on no one's side. Think we'll be home by this time next year? Mitchell asked. I think Germany will be defeated by then, Cartwright said. Whether the Swiss release us immediately or hold us until all the diplomatic paperwork is done, that's another question. I just want to fly again, Wilson said quietly. Not over Germany. Not over anywhere combat-related. I just want to feel an aircraft respond to my hands, to climb through clouds, to land at a field where no one's shooting at me. I want to fly without fear. You'll fly again, Mitchell assured him. We all will. And when we do, we'll remember what happened here. We'll remember Thompson and Harrison and all the others who died over neutral territory. We'll remember that neutrality isn't passive, it's an active choice that sometimes requires violence to maintain. We'll remember that Switzerland survived by shooting down everyone equally, and that in the moral accounting of war, that's somehow both completely wrong and strategically necessary. The church bells in the valley below began to ring, marking midnight, marking Christmas, marking another day that the war continued and they remained trapped between sides. Merry Christmas, Cartwright said with dark irony. Merry Christmas, Wilson and Mitchell replied. And in the distance, beyond the mountains, the war raged on. Bombers flew, fighters fought, men died on all sides. But in Switzerland, in the heart of Europe, an island of peace was maintained through the paradox of armed neutrality. The only way to stay out of the war was to be willing to fight everyone who threatened that status. American bomber crews had been shocked when Swiss fighters shot them down over neutral territory. But shock gave way to understanding, understanding gave way to acceptance, and acceptance gave way to the grim knowledge that would shape post-war aviation. There were no safe havens in the sky, no neutral ground that didn't demand blood for passage, no territory so removed from war that it wouldn't defend itself with lethal force. Wilson and his surviving crew would return home in May 1945, after Germany's surrender, after months of internment in a country that had killed their friends to stay alive. They would tell their story to anyone who would listen, and their story would join the larger narrative of World War, either dramatic battles or heroic victories. But the small tragedies of men caught in impossible situations, where the right choice and the wrong choice looked exactly the same until it was too late. Liberty Belle's wreckage remained in a Swiss meadow for months before being cleared away, her aluminum melted down and repurposed by Swiss industry. The crater she left was filled in, grass was replanted, and within a year, there was no evidence that an American bomber had ever crashed there, no memorial to the violence that neutrality required. But the men who survived remembered. They remembered the shock of being fired upon by a country they thought was safe. They remembered the faces of friends who didn't make it home. They remembered the cold calculation that turned human lives into diplomatic symbols, proof of neutrality written in blood across the Alpine sky. And whenever they flew after that in peacetime, in civilian aircraft, in skies where no one was trying to kill them, they remembered to check their navigation carefully, to respect every border, to understand that neutral meant nothing more than equally dangerous to everyone. That was the lesson Switzerland taught them. That was the price of passage through neutral airspace. That was the shock that never quite wore off, even decades later, even in the safety of home, the knowledge that peace, like war, sometimes requires killing to maintain.